you mentioned the fact that visceral fat, what's associated with it is that fat going into the muscles and shrinking them also. So you're going to have the marbling, the shrinking, and they're going to perform less than optimal at that point. Is it fair to say that the visceral fat comes first and then as time goes on, it goes into the muscle, or do they both kind of happen around the same time?
Boy, really good question. I do a lot of shows on visceral fat, and that's the first time I've ever gotten that. So it is the case that visceral fat happens first. So in those young kids, we see their muscles are free of that myosteatosis, that human marbling initially. But as visceral fat accumulates, slowly with time, you get this marbleization. Now, these are honestly steaks. So this is a completely different species. These would be known as cows. And so the same thing happens with humans, though. As they develop visceral fat, the marbleization starts occurring in their muscles. But the other interesting thing is we see visceral fat get eradicated first. And then it's followed by muscles, myosteatosis. That marbling will leave the muscle eventually. So when I do my follow-up scans, I want to get the best results possible. I've been doing this for a long time, 13 years, optimizing humans. So I got it down to a real art form. And so I don't want to show them a follow-up scan that doesn't have much difference. I want to knock their socks off. So when they do the strategies I tell them to do, they see that visceral fat is gone. And they see eventually, when it's the right time, I scan those legs and I show them that fat is gone too. So yeah, to answer your question, first, when you start living properly, nature gets rid of the most dangerous stuff, visceral fat first. It goes away faster, it's larger. And it's not that this, I don't want to suggest this isn't dangerous, because the truth is, just recently, 3 months ago, AI is just, it's like a whole new filter that just looks at things better. And so AI went back and studied looked at all these other studies that talked about muscle fat, and what they found was that what humans hadn't figured out is convincingly, this doubles your risk for death from a heart attack or stroke compared to obesity. So as bad as obesity is for heart attacks and strokes, and you should, if you're listening to this podcast, know that obesity really is incompatible and inimical to a healthy life, then you really ought to be alarmed at the notion that there's something 2 times worse. And it's this fatty infiltrate here. And it already always corresponds to visceral fat. So yeah, it's a big problem, and you should be thinking about it.
One of my favorite Quicksilver Scientific products is their liposomal vitamin C. It's great for immune support, collagen production, and antioxidant protection. The liposome is a great delivery system for effectively getting the vitamin C into your body. Save 15% by clicking the link in the description, and now back to the show. You're likely going to get to this next, but as you talk about the heart, where my mind goes, you're showing this picture here of the 2 different steaks. The heart and our blood vessels have muscle in them. We've been talking about this from a skeletal muscle, our voluntary muscles to this point perspective, when you show pictures of the legs and such. So when you talk about danger of a heart attack, is it because the muscle of the heart is becoming infiltrated like the skeletal muscle?
Yeah, already I've done a lot of podcasts. You've asked the best questions I've ever had of any host. So fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, let me show you an example of that heart fat. Okay, so these 2 dark structures to the on the right and left are your lungs. So this is your scan through your chest. Now, in between your lung is where your heart resides. And I've already mentioned on an MRI scan that fat shows up as white. So, and this color, this is all fat around the heart of, believe it or not, a 34-year-old male who happened to be a distance runner. He would run 8 to 10 marathons a year. This is his visceral fat. So he's filled with visceral fat, but you should also see he has very little subcu fat. Do you see how thin he is on the outside? So there's a lot of people that are thin outside and fat inside. We call them TOFIs. And distance runners are like that. And people that eat a lot of carbohydrates and maybe exercise a lot. So who's really thin on the outside and is filled with visceral fat? Bodybuilders. They're another class of people. And so they're looking at all their muscle and they're looking at the wrong kind of fat, the fat outside. Is the perfect fat to look at, I suppose, if you're doing a bodybuilding competition and you want to show striations and you don't want to show a thin layer of fat. But that hard fat also corresponds to that visceral fat, and that's what we see in here. So that's fat around the heart. You also alluded to whether fat gets deposited in the muscle tissue itself, because there's 3 types of muscle tissue in the human body. The first was we mentioned and we showed examples of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle are like muscles in your arms, your legs, your abdominal musculature. Those are muscles that you operate, that you fire, and you get to do stuff. Like when you plank, use your abdominal muscles. When you do pull-ups, you're doing your arm muscles, your skeletal muscles. Your cardiac muscle is completely different. It's firing, but it's firing automatically. You're not volitionally thinking about it. And it has a histologically, meaning how you look at it underneath a microscope, very different type of typology. So as a med student, we had to look under a microscope and be able to identify skeletal muscle versus cardiac muscle versus the third type of muscle, which is smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is still altogether different from skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And smooth muscle is found within your endocrine system, your gastrointestinal system, your GI tract, and within your cardiovascular system, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Capillaries are the unspoken darlings of our health. That's where the magic happens. That's where we exchange oxygen, nutrition, energy to feed and support ourselves. I'm an active duty lieutenant colonel in the Army National Guard. And so I have some military concepts, not a lot. They don't call me to play in the wars. I'm in the back taking care of people. But I do know something about battle plans. And you got to have supply lines. And the better your supply lines, the better your troops are in their operations and being able to do what they want and need to do. Same thing with your cells. But almost nobody thinks about their capillaries and the state of that supply line being able to feed, provide, and support all the tissues. Every cell of your body is mediated through those capillaries. And so what happens in with regard to visceral fat and fatty infiltration is fat gets deposited in the skeletal muscle. I think fat is being deposited within the cardiac myometrium, the cardiac tissue, cardiac cells. And the third area I think fat is also invading and infiltrating is the smooth muscle tissue of those arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now, why do I say that? Well, I just have this theory because as we eliminate visceral fat and this cardiac fat, something very interesting is happening, and I'll just skip ahead for the moment, within arteries. So in this scan, we're looking at brain arteries. So dark is blood flow, and do you see how hazy it's getting, how hazy it gets right here, and how it's devoid right there? That's a big plaque. And we can move over to, let me just get this scan so you can see this side, how hazy it is on this other side too. The blood flow is not as good. And this process, this plaque that's happening is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So I like to say it's clogged plumbing. A major artery in the brain, this happens to be the middle cerebral artery, is the blood flow is being compromised by soft plaque that's being deposited in there. But what happens, which is exciting, is this artery is opened up here, and the other artery is opened up. That huge plaque is completely opened up in just 9 months after eliminating visceral fat, by eliminating visceral fat, not after eliminating, by eliminating visceral fat. Those arteries opened up. So blood flow improved. And so what I theorize is those capillaries that are distal to that artery are also opening up, and probably less infiltration of that. Now, I'd like to have, if there's a pathologist out there, histopathologist that does fresh frozen slices and processing histological specimens of those capillaries and arteries, I'd love to be able to show its correlation to visceral fat. It's just that I can't see that on an MRI scan. So it's just theoretical until it's being done. But what I can support anecdotally, Jesse, is when those arteries open up, people's memory is improved, their intelligence improved, their error rate is improved. And this is why we start scanning brains, is after scanning 6,000 abdomens at the very end, 7 years of doing this study, right at the last year, we scanned 20 brains and we saw these clogged arteries. And it took us forever because people kept harassing us. Why am I getting smarter? Why is my memory improving? Why do I make less mistakes? And so we ultimately we got tired of answering, we don't know. So we started scanning brains and we saw these clogged arteries are opening up. Now, the other interesting thing that happened is people who open up those arteries, their arterial pulsites, instead of where you could feel it, you could see it. Their arteries became visibly pulsatile. So you get this confirmation, visually mediated by your own body's ability to see that your blood flow is now improved to the point that you can see those pulses all over your body. So I have them in 18 different locations that I can see. And my clients, once I get them to get rid of visceral fat, open up their arteries, they get these visible pulses. So I like to tout that as a key biological indicator that people ought to be looking at, besides visceral fat, is the visible appearance of pulsatile arteries that they can see in their bodies, absolutely free. So I think it's worth pointing as for the sake of the audience, that there's an association or correlation with visceral fat, visceral adipose tissue, with myosteatosis, which is infiltration of fat in the muscle, or fatty muscle replacement, where literally muscle is being replaced with fat. And so those adipocytes, those fat cells, are different types of fat. But there's a correlation. So what's interesting is you can be pretty simple about this and say, you know what? All I really have to do is target visceral fat, get rid of it, and I will get rid of my muscle fat, and I will get rid of my organ fat around your organ, like surrounding your heart, and then fat deposited within your organs, such as fatty liver disease.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
I want to knock their socks off. So when they do the strategies I tell them to do, they see that visceral fat is gone. This doubles your risk for death from a heart attack or stroke.